City Matters.
Hello and welcome to our second episode of our series through with Zach Einstein Astrof, as we are here at HMTV and Influential Origins. Zach, thank you so much for spending that second period with us right now.
Of course.
Zach, tell me, what are the motivations here as to, why you've been an advocate on this issue?
It has everything to do with my family history. So my name is Zachary. My Hebrew name is Zacharia, with the core of that being zachor, which means to remember. And that means to remember my family story. So my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor. He's from Ulm, Germany, and he was fortunate enough to get out and make it to America in 1939.
Do you know more of his story?
Yeah. So
Why don't you go into a little detail for me?
Sure. So his family was able to escape Nazi Germany in 1939 and came here with pretty much nothing. And because my namesake is to remember our story, I feel like that has a meaning of its own, and then there's the meaning that I've given it. So the meaning that it implicitly has is that I have to make sure that the world doesn't forget what happened to my grandfather, and kind of that's a microcosm for the larger issue, which is what happened to the Jewish people. And not let them forget the tragedy of the Holocaust and the ways that humans and that Jews have been treated, because humanity has let them be treated like that. And then how I've given that meaning is kind of joining this fight against anti-Semitism. When my grandfather came to this country in 1939, he was a refugee of hate, and the hate that he escaped is the same hatred that is now infecting our college campuses and this country at large. So for me, getting involved in fighting that hatred and fighting that anti-Semitism is kind of, the rallying cry of my family history, of my life. Like, that's who I was named after. That's the purpose of my name. So that's what I'm going to do.
Is your grandfather around today?
Yes, thank God he is.
Did he ever imagine what we are seeing today in America?
No. And when I talked to him about it, what's happening on college campuses and just what he's seeing with the overall narrative and environment in this country is somewhat similar, as he says, to Nazi Germany, at the time that his family left. This hatred towards Jewish people is becoming so accepted, normalized, and people have become complacent with it. And obviously there are the broader issues. You see violent anti-Semitic protests at college campuses, people being assaulted, people even being killed, the one man in California who was killed. And then there's the softer side of it, which doesn't, rear its head as much in the public view, but is equally as important, which is this kind of culture that we've created of becoming complacent with these microaggressions against Jewish people. Jewish students are sitting in class and have to hear their professors spew these falsities about what's happening in Israel, and that's just being accepted. Or in my own personal experience, having a professor who has a free Gaza sticker on her laptop that I have to stare at every single class. Like, these are things that are just becoming okay now, that is something that's just as important. We have to focus on just as much, because that should not be accepted.
Now, peaceful protest, you understand and are completely okay with, and you've,
of course,
actually
country is founded on free speech. It's a very important value.
Right, and you've tried to have on your campus some discussions with people that had other views. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so that's gone two separate ways. So Students for Justice in Palestine is the predominant, pro-Palestinian group on campuses nationwide, and they have a stated, rule that they can't talk to Zionists because it legitimizes our cause. So I've gone to a few of these events, these Students for Justice in Palestine events, and I've tried to, have conversation with some of the members and just gain their perspective and understand why they're out there and what exactly they support, and see if we can find some common ground. And I have not been able to get past 2 minutes in conversation with any of them before someone else comes up to them and kind of grabs their arm and says, like, no, you can't talk to him. We have to go. And that is like the collapse of civil discourse. Not allowing for those conversations to happen is exactly the main problem that we're happening. So how I've kind of adapted to that is trying to find people on the outskirts that maybe aren't involved in the group but support the cause, and talk to them, because they'll actually talk to me and understand why they're there. So a good example of that is on the first anniversary, the 1 year anniversary of October 7th, 2024, on my campus, there was a pro-Palestinian demonstration, let's call it. It wasn't a protest, it was a demonstration, because they were able to, get the rights to the main part of campus, which was obviously very disheartening to see, on the 1 year anniversary of the most tragic day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Our campus was riddled with, Palestinian propaganda.
So they were celebrating the murder of Jews on that day.
I don't know if I'd call it celebrating the murder of Jews, but they kind of marked it as a significant or historic day, and they more so took the stance of the victims as, oh, it's been 1 year of this terrible war that's been waged on us, as if Israel had started the war. But so the way that I was able to finally find conversation was going to the outskirts of demonstrations or protests like these. And on this specific day, on the 1 year anniversary of October 7th, I found this girl sitting on the outside of the protest wearing a homemade shirt that said "From the River" on the front and then "To the Sea" on the back. And I went up to her and I asked her, I was like, "Hi, my name is Zach. It's nice to meet you. I'd love to understand why you're here today and what you're here to support." And she told me that in all honesty, she didn't really know much about the issue, but she felt that it was like her moral obligation to be there and to support. And I asked her, "Why is it your moral obligation?" She's like, "Well, the people in Palestine are facing a genocide." And that statement right there, I think, is it shows what the large majority of people in this country think. We can't attribute to malice what we can to incompetence. Of course, I'm not going to be able to talk to the Students for Justice in Palestine kids, but these other people that are supporting the cause, they genuinely don't know what's happening. So I sat there for 20 minutes and I told her, what's happening, why this war started, some of the history, the timeline of what's happened in Israel starting in 1947. And by the end of our 20-minute conversation, she thanked me for the information, said she didn't know any of it, and she got up and she left the protest. And I think that is exactly what we need to be striving for, because if you arm yourself with the proper information to have these conversations, and you feel emboldened enough to go up to people and your stuff, you can change hearts and minds.
And just so that people who might listen to this and not know the history particularly well,
right?
Just to spend a couple minutes on this so that people have an understand. To be a Zionist means that you believe that the Jewish people can have a sovereign state in their
ancestral homeland.
Mm-hmm. Not to the exclusion of others, but simply that they have a right to live there. So that other people could live there too, which is what happens today, but that they too have a right to stand there.
And I think that that's something that people really misunderstand. Now, Israel is in the Middle East, of course, and it's surrounded by so many Muslim majority and Arab countries, and yet people are so angry at this one tiny New Jersey-sized state that's a Jewish state. And by saying a Jewish state, that doesn't mean it's just for Jews, it's for all people, but it's majority Jewish to ensure that the Jewish people have a safe haven, which was abundantly necessary after the Holocaust. And with each day that we live right now, it becomes more and more clear why the state of Israel is so necessary.
Because for your grandfather, who was very blessed to escape to America, when frankly the vast majority of Jews like my parents couldn't come to America, they also couldn't go to Israel because in 1939 it didn't exist.
Right.
So understanding what Zionism is, genocide's a word also that was created after the Holocaust, because you know how many Jews were murdered in the Holocaust?
6 million. It's a number that's almost even hard to fathom.
Hard to fathom such a large number.
Right.
And from a percentage standpoint, in Poland, you had 90% of the Jews.
Right. It was so awful that the Jewish population still hasn't recovered. The amount of Jews in the world today is still lower than it was pre-Holocaust, which is really a testament to the tragedy. And I think something that's so awful is that now the word genocide is just being thrown around so loosely. And it's become one of these popular buzzwords that people choose to use when describing what's happening in Israel. But again, it falls into this, popular set of terms that people love to use when not a single one of them is true. People claim genocide. Israel is waging maybe the most moral example of urban modern warfare in human history. The UN finds that normally in urban modern warfare, the civilian to combatant casualty ratio is 9-1. And numbers from logical sources range between 1.5 to 1 to 4 to 1 for what's happening right now in Gaza, making this really a textbook example of a moral war. And on top of that, we can see why. I mean, Israel is dropping hundreds of thousands of leaflets, sending millions of texts and calls to people in these areas that are going to be affected, saying the time to get out is now. If you want to save your lives and save your family's lives, you need to leave. They're trying everything that they possibly can to ensure that civilians are out of harm's way as they go after Hamas. But people completely discredit that, just like people will claim that Israel is an apartheid, which completely discredits the fact that there are 20% of Israel's population are Arab Muslims, and they live with, the exact same rights and abilities as every other Israeli does, whether they're Israeli Jewish, Israeli Christian, Israeli Muslim, Israeli Druze. They all have the same rights and the same capabilities to pursue the life that they want. There are Muslim judges who have put, Jewish government officials in jail, and they still have the nerve to call it an apartheid. People just don't do their homework.
And one person, one vote for every Israeli citizen.
Exactly.
Regardless of your religious background, your race, your creed, your sexual orientation. Is there another country in the Middle East that allows people to have different sexual orientations?
No, and I find that such an interesting thing too, because you'll find kind of these branches of the pro-Palestinian movement, one of which is, like Gays for Gaza. And I find that kind of mind-boggling because Israel is home to, Tel Aviv is home to the largest pride celebration in the world. And people can be openly gay in Israel. Of course they can. I mean, it's a free country, but no other country in the Middle East can say the same about their country.
Same with the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, there are Jews. When you were in Israel, did you meet Ethiopian Jews?
Oh, of course. Yeah, we visited an Ethiopian community, and they're proud Israelis. They choose to serve in the IDF as well.
Proud Black Jews.
And people don't even know that exists, which is what I think is so problematic, and I think what has caused such a big problem on campuses and in the country at large is, the misinformation that people have. I like to say that the two reasons why, the Jews in America and Israelis have such a bad rep right now is the two I's. One is ideology and one is information. So in ideology, many people, especially my age college students, especially people in the political realm, view all these conflicts through a constructivist lens, which is what has happened in my life, and with my lived experiences, how can I relate to what has happened? But the reality is people can't relate to what's happening. If you weren't an American during World War II, you didn't know what it was like to be, for Pearl Harbor to happen, and that's why we then got involved in the war and started attacking Japan. In the same voice, people who aren't Israeli don't know what it was like to incur October 7th. They don't know what it was like to incur these wars that they didn't start in 47 and 73, the Intifadas, the Lebanon War in 06. They don't know what it's like to have to constantly face the threat of terrorism. And for that reason, they can't fully understand what's happening. Now, the other part of ideology is what's become so mainstream today is this whole idea of the white oppressor and the colored oppressed. And people have labeled the Israelis as the white oppressor, which I find hilarious because if you know a Mizrahi Jew, which is a large part of Israel, you know that Jews aren't just white. I come from Great Neck, which is a predominantly Persian American town.
Right.
You want to go tell an Iranian American that they're white?
Right.
I mean, and people just don't know this, but yet they still use these labels. And then that brings us to the second I, which is information. Now, part of that is the media, the way that this has been portrayed, lends itself to people believing these things. To some extent, I don't blame a lot of these people who have never learned about Israel or about Jews for believing what they believe, because they look at the biased media. If you read the New York Times articles and all they can talk about is the death toll in Gaza, then you're not getting the full picture and you don't understand why this war happened. Israel didn't start this war. Israel didn't want this to happen. They didn't choose to be attacked and incur their worst day of violence since the Holocaust. Yet that's the reality that they have faced and that they have perennially faced since the creation of the State of Israel. And as such, these conflicts continue to happen. And just like people don't know that, people don't know that Jews have been the perennial refugees of time. You know, my family had to escape Germany. Other people's families in my town had to escape the Iranian Revolution in 79, just like other families, Jewish families had to escape Syria or Iraq or Russia or Poland. The list goes on. But because people don't know this, because it's not portrayed in the media, because it's not taught in school, people don't know this. And as such, it's the job of myself, and I believe the job of Jewish people, and especially Jewish students on college campuses right now, to arm themselves with the facts, to understand their family history, to understand the Jewish history, to understand Israel's history. And with that knowledge, they can educate other people. Make sure your family knows, make sure your friends know, make sure the people around you know. Because when you're sitting in class and a professor says something that's anti-Semitic or completely false about Israel and it stings, slaps you in the face like wind on a cold winter day, and you're paralyzed, you have to know what to say there. Because if you don't, it repeats and repeats, and the claims get worse and worse until all of a sudden the Jews are demonized just as badly as they were demonized in Nazi Germany. You know, that whole period, that we're in the beginning of it. You know, like
right.
the demonization and exclusion of Jews started in academia before Hitler came into power. Now we're seeing a similar trend right now in what's happening in academia. So the time is now to take our stand, to say these things that you're saying aren't correct, and that starts with us knowing
when you
our
say
facts.
It started in academia and you started on student body, and as opposed to the one or two people that you spoke to,
mm-hmm.
whether it was in your school, which thankfully wasn't as bad as some, but
right.
in others, just briefly, because I think we have to go through it. Tell me some of the things that Jewish students have been hearing, and your friends from Great Neck that have gone to other universities,
right?
You know, whether it's Columbia, UPenn, or others, have been hearing.
Right. So thankfully, the University of Maryland has been much more tame than in any other places, than many other places in the country. But that being said, the fact that I can call Maryland tame while people are still having experiences such as a good friend of mine in the architecture school, his personal desk was vandalized with Palestinian propaganda and anti-Jewish slogans. A friend of mine was singled out in her class and berated with questions about the war in Gaza because she's Jewish. I had a professor who had a free Gaza sticker with the red fist, an ode to the Ramallah lynching of 2000. You know, these are things that
people don't know that. It's the bloody hands that mean that what that signifies is Jews happened to walk into a Palestinian area and they were ripped limb from limb.
Right.
And now that's a battle cry that they make stickers out of, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And we see those things on our campus, and that's tame. The fact that that's considered tame is awful. And then you have these protests where people are chalking all over the main parts of campus that the whole student body has to walk through, saying Holocaust 2.0, Holocaust 2024. And it's awful, it's disheartening, and the worst part about it is that that's tame. I have friends at Michigan, I have friends at Tulane, I have friends at Yale, where they know people that have been spat at or physically assaulted or followed, and these things just happen. You know, they just happen again and again. You see another one in the news, your mom sends you another instance of it, your friend calls you and tells you another instance of it. It just keeps happening.
Right, and you think you're next.
I mean, that's kind of the trend that we're seeing, and that's why it's so important right now for Jewish students on campus to, as I said, get involved with this fight against anti-Semitism. And paramount, what is paramount is to arm yourself with the information to be able to have these kinds of conversations.
So, needing to arm people, tell me, in Maryland, what did you do once you were living in this situation with Holocaust 2.0 and
right.
red fists of blood tearing Jews limb from limb, examples of, and people being beaten and spat on? What did you do about this in your school and in Maryland?
Right. So as this kind of shift happened on our campus, I immediately knew, like, it's go time. Now is the time when we need to be strong. So I started TERPAC along with two other students, which is a cadre of APAC with a dual-faceted goal, one of which being on the legislative side to host phone banking events and getting in communication with our local and state representatives to, you know, support and advocate for anti-Semitism legislation to ensure that the kinds of things that are happening on some of the more virulent and hateful campuses across the country doesn't happen at Maryland. And the other part is the education part, which is going out to the broader campus, because it's great for our Jewish community to understand what's happening. But what's more important is to educate the broader campus, the people who don't understand what's happening, and going out there and doing things such as tabling and explaining why the war in Gaza is happening, what Zionism is, why it is so important, why it's pertinent that Israel exists, and then as well as some fundraising for things such as Magen David Adom, medical emergency services in Israel.
Oh, by the way, we actually raised money here for an ambulance that we paid for from the center. So you go down this path and you start to work with the Maryland State Legislature. So tell me about that experience.
Right. So not so long ago, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, I had the honor of testifying in front of the Maryland State Senate and the Maryland House of Delegates regarding 3 different bills. Now, one of them was cross-listed in both the Senate and the House, and that was the Campus Act, which aims to provide a more...
Tell me what the bill is about,
Yeah.
what it talks about.
Yeah, it aims to set a more specific... It aims to set more specific verbiage for what constitutes anti-Semitism on these campuses, because, you know, people are finding these loopholes where they won't get in trouble for saying things that are certainly hateful, but doesn't quite break the rules. And that's why you get protests where people are writing things like Holocaust 2024, Holocaust 2.0, why some of these hateful rhetoric is being used on campus that can technically be used but shouldn't be used. And then the other bill was advocating for having a Title VI coordinator in Maryland universities and public schools to ensure that people that are the victim of anti-Semitic or any form of discriminatory hatred at their school have a trained point of contact that they can go to, that they can say, this is what happened to me, and they can be helped through their situation.
So just let's unpack this a little bit for a second. So when someone writes Holocaust 2024 on a wall, the words might not be hateful words, but what they're saying is, we're going to now wipe out the Jews again, just like we did in 1939. We're out for it again here. 2.0, now we're going to do it again. We're going to do it better, right? So that word might not be hateful, but...
The implication of it certainly is.
The implication of it certainly is.
Especially as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, those are not terms that should just be thrown around loosely.
Right. It's a direct threat that they're going to actually commit real genocide.
Yet they do it in a way that they're able to hide behind the specific rules for what constitutes hate speech. Right, and as such, they don't get in trouble for it.
Yeah, which is pretty incredible, right?
Which is what the Campus Act really aims to change.
And so for those that are not familiar with Title VI, can you talk a little bit about Title VI?
Right, so Title VI is every person does not, on the basis of race, sex, religion, or gender, people cannot be discriminated against.
When it's the workplace, it's Title VII. Title VI is for universities and academic locations.
So this is something that doesn't just serve the Jewish people, but serves campuses at large. That if anyone faces discrimination on the basis of their identity, they have someone to talk to about it, and they can ensure that not only will justice be served for it, but it won't happen again, and that there could be more stringent rules in place.
So then you get this opportunity to speak before the Maryland State Legislature. And what did you tell them?
Well, first of all, I told them about why this issue is so important to me. I talked about my family history, and I talked about how, as a college student on campus right now, on a tame campus, I'm seeing how hateful a tame campus is. And obviously there are campuses worse than that across the country. So if this is the kind of culture that's festering its way into American academia right now, we need to stop this now before it gets significantly worse, which it certainly will if this goes unchecked.
How were you received by the state legislature?
I think it went very well, and we're hopefully going to hear back very soon about if those bills passed or not. But it did certainly seem like we had the support of the state assembly.
These are ongoing battles that are going on in multiple states, as we know right now as we speak. The college anti-Semitism bill before the Congress, it passed the House of Representatives last year, but it was stalled in the Senate, didn't get through. We need it now to come back again. It hasn't yet. Here in New York State, which is the most populous Jewish state in America, and the most populous Jewish location outside of Israel, there still isn't the modern definition of anti-Semitism adopted, meaning it's okay to criticize Israel, but if you criticize the right of Jews to have a place of their own that exists in sovereignty like every other nation in the world, that's anti-Semitism. If you're judging Israel in a way differently than you would any other country in the world, that's anti-Semitism. If you're holding it to standards only Israel and you only talk about Israel when there are events going on everywhere else in the world, that's anti-Semitism. And of course, when you're threatening to physically assault Jews and make them feel at fear at all times and places, that's anti-Semitism. So Zach, I can't thank you enough for being here today. I think it was so important for you to be here. I think it's so important for you to be the advocate that you are. I am blessed to meet you and so blessed that you're doing this work. And I really can't explain enough to people how important it is that we have these conversations and make progress in the world with it. So on that note, I want to thank you for being here and thank everyone for listening.